On Fancred, I'm Brooks Melchoir, live from Los Angeles today. Big show for you as always, right here on Fancred at noon Eastern time. We do it every weekday and a full show. New news coming out of the NBA. Adam Silver is adding to his comments in public about China, now safely stateside. He's at this Time Health 100, whatever it is, presentation. He's a panelist. He's being interviewed. And so he has addressed the China situation for the first time since, I think, October 8th. And so we'll get to his comments. I've got them for you here in a second, and we'll analyze them like only we can. But we've got a lot of stuff coming up. We've got a focus on what's going on ESPN. There's been a lot of talk about ESPN in China, and we've kind of set it up for you with the ESPN agreements with the big Chinese broadcast company Tencent, which quite obviously compromises ESPN in its coverage of the NBA in China. So we're going to go and look at what some of the people on ESPN have been saying. It's going to shock you. It's going to shock you if you haven't seen it, what some of the ESPN analysts have said about particularly LeBron James's responses in public earlier this week to Daryl Morey's tweet and the entire situation in China. We're going to have some video of that, and you just won't believe it if you have it on my Twitter feed. But we'll have that. Plus, we're going to have a guy who has really broken the only substantive story about ESPN and its coverage of the NBA in China over the last 2 weeks, which indicates there was an active effort to try to cover up what's going on over in China. And that'll be Ben Strauss of the Washington Post, who is a reporter who has a lot of contacts for context, right? But he's going to join us and fill us in on and give us kind of a inside look that nobody else, that's the key here, no one else can provide that on what's going on over at ESPN, at least in the context of their coverage of what's happening with the NBA in China. And we'll also get into college football. We did a lot of pro football yesterday, particularly with Andrew Brandt and with Greg Bedard. This time we're going to talk to Peter Burns, who is going to take us to really what is the epicenter of college football, the beating heart, the soul of college football. He is the face of the SEC network, Peter Burns, and he's going to join us. He's phenomenal. He is a great analyst and a great host, but when I say he's phenomenal, he's not just a good talker. He's got a lot of insight and understands what's interesting out of all of these football programs in the SEC and what's happening right now. We're going to look ahead to what's going to play out in the SEC this week and what he thinks is going to happen in the future. And then also we're going to have, for my money, a guy who writes the best college football column, weekly column, and you've never heard of it, but it's on The Athletic, and it's worth a subscription unto itself. It's called Bubble Screen. Bubble Screen. His name is John Walters. He's been around a long time Sports Illustrated reporter, but he's worked for many different outlets. And he writes this compendium of what happened over the weekend on Mondays that comes out in The Athletic, on The Athletic's website. And so we're going to talk to him coming up here in a few minutes about just some of the things that he has seen going on. But his column is just phenomenal because it combines all of the elements of college football as it is reflected upon and interfaces with the media, because television is everything. Streaming is everything when it comes to college football. We talked about that yesterday with John Wilner, of course, who covers the Pac-12 and the Pac-12 network. Well, John is a guy who literally covers those images as they hurtle through the air, but not only just the television broadcasters, but the broadcasts themselves. And he's got an amazing thing that he tracked down from watching Florida State and Clemson last weekend. And so we're going to talk to him about that coming up. That'll be just in a few minutes, not far away. John Walters will join us. So we'll do that. And our producer is Cam Smith. He is with us in Boston. As usual, understand they're having some inclement weather up there. Hopefully everybody's okay up in New England right now with a nor'easter, I suppose. At least that's what I've been hearing, is a bearing down. But, of course, we're here in Los Angeles, where the thing about LA that's amazing, and I grew up in Kansas City originally, is the weather here is extracted from your life. It's not a consideration in your life. When you live in Southern California, it's something you just forget about. So it's once, and once we get through this summer and we start to hear about the winter and the nor'easters, if you will, it gets to the point where it's kind of hard to relate unless, of course, you're traveling back to the East Coast and dealing with that all the time, and the Midwest for that matter, and the Northwest. So, but I wanted initially some things that just took place. Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, who of course was caught right in the middle of the controversy involving the NBA, China, and a tweet from Houston general manager Daryl Morey. He commented today at a conference involving Time Magazine, and he had a couple of comments in particular about that situation that I'm going to relate to you now, and we're going to break down those comments and bridge them to what's happened in the past and what my observations are based on my own overall analysis of the situation. So this is Adam Silver at a conference for Time Magazine that took place earlier today, and these are some of the things that he said. And one of the things that he said was, quote, "I felt we made enormous progress in building cultural exchanges with the Chinese people, and I have regret that much of it is lost." He also described the financial consequences to be fairly dramatic based on what just took place in China. And of course, I don't have to explain to you by now what took place, the response to the tweet of Daryl Morey that, while portrayed as coming from the Chinese people, really came from the Chinese government. And I'm going to give you a great example before I really break down and analyze these comments from Adam Silver. Another comment that was recorded on the Twitter feed of Time Magazine, a particular reporter who was interviewing Adam Silver earlier today. Here is the tweet that went out from this reporter. Adam Silver says the use of regrettable in the original Chinese language tweet was modifying the fact that we had upset our Chinese fans. Let me read that one more time. Adam Silver says the use of, quote, regrettable, unquote, in the original tweet that went out specifically in the Chinese language was, quote, modifying the fact that we had upset our Chinese fans. Now, this is the crux of the issue. This is the bottom line of the issue. And this, to me, reveals the true colors of Adam Silver. I understand he's in an impossible situation from a financial perspective, all right, but not in a moral quandary at all. It's clear what's going on here. And instead of giving you necessarily an opinion on it, even though I've done it over the past few days, all week really, in trying to characterize what's really going on in the situation, I have what is essentially a smoking gun now, and it comes from the Wall Street Journal in the context of what my whole point is about this situation between the NBA and China. What is really happening? And it comes from Ben Cohen, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, who published a report in reporting a study that the Wall Street Journal, an investigation, if you will, had done of the followers, right? A demographic breakdown, an analysis of tweets that came from the Twitter followers of the original Daryl Morey tweet. That is to say, people who responded and replied to that original Daryl Morey tweet, right? It was a demographic breakdown of those Twitter accounts, right? And an analysis of what those Twitter accounts said in relation to the original Daryl Morey tweet that caused the firestorm that played out earlier this week. And so now I'm going to read from this Wall Street Journal report. It's extremely important. Once you look at the comments of Adam Silver and a lot of this story, be it a fundamental understanding or misunderstanding of what's happening over China in relation to those comments, it, to me, is something that is critical in bridging it to this story I'm about to read you. All right. So from the Wall Street Journal, this comes from Ben Cohen, and he writes, Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, was mentioned more than 16,000 times in the 12 hours immediately after his now infamous October 4th tweet. Many of the mentions came from users who'd never tweeted before. 4,855 users exactly, and 3,677 accounts didn't even exist until Morey's October 4th tweet. That is according to analysis of 168,907 tweets at Morey, directed at Morey between October 4th, the date of the original tweet, and October 10th. Right? And now here's a quote from Ben Nimno, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. He told the Wall Street Journal, it looks like there were humans at the keyboard for many of these posts. This wasn't primarily a bot swarm. It was a troll mob, which is a lot harder to deal with. The Wall Street Journal goes on. That means Morey's phone was peppered with notifications at 2 per second, including more than 4,700, which included the phrase, your mother is dead, or MSL, which in Chinese is translated as your mother is dead. So that's what he was receiving more than 4,700 times. Now, this is to say that he had notifications turned on for his phone as he was receiving replies for his tweets. Something tells me he probably doesn't have them turned on, and more than likely didn't have them turned on. Let's hope so, for his own sake, for his phone's sake, before he put out that tweet on October 4th. But I want to repeat this one phrase one more time from the story in the Wall Street Journal that really underlines this entire situation. These are all the replies coming, all the replies that were coming into Daryl Morey on his account, replying to that original tweet. Many mentions came from users who'd never tweeted before, 4,855 users. They commented on his tweet and tweeted at him. 3,677 accounts that never existed. And they sent 168,970 tweets at Daryl Morey between October 4th and October 10th. All right, what the hell does that mean? That means those are real people. At least that's what we get from the forensic researcher, the digital forensic researcher, Ben Nimno at the Atlantic Council, right? And what this indicates is there was a concerted effort by thousands of people, right, to go after Daryl Morey, to intimidate Daryl Morey specifically. These tweets weren't directed at the media. They were directed at him, right? These tweets weren't bots. They were a huge number of accounts set up by individuals. That's what's been traced. Now, the key point here is, where did they come from? How were they able to mass that quickly together and make that concerted effort? Or was this something organic? Was it organic? Because that's extraordinary. That kind of a response, right, from brand new accounts and usernames. The key point here is Chinese Twitter doesn't exist. There is no Twitter in China. It's been blocked in China for over 10 years. So how is it that all these accounts were created, thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of tweets were shot at Maury right after he tweeted that out, a seemingly innocuous tweet? No matter where you live, that's a somewhat innocuous tweet, whether you're in the mainland of China or Hong Kong. That's my opinion, but it's the way that the Chinese government portrays it that makes it so serious. My whole point in laying out this connection between the trolls, the people that all suddenly created accounts and started, thousands of them, tweeting at Daryl Morey in this concerted and deliberate effort to intimidate him, right after he tweets. Of course, the original tweet was, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong," right? The whole point is that this is the Chinese government. That's what's behind this sort of organic response to anything on Twitter. You really don't. If you've been on Twitter long enough, you don't have to be a digital forensic researcher to know that. But that's what happened. And that's something that's very reminiscent of government attacks in massing and enabling and recruiting trolls to attack people, misrepresent people on social media. And that clearly is what has taken place here. It could not be more clear, but I didn't need this report from the Wall Street Journal to tell me what's going on. I've told you about this the last few days. It couldn't be more obvious just in the fact that there's no Twitter in China. So how is it that 1.4 billion Chinese, as the government wants you to believe, and I might add, the owner of the Brooklyn Nets, Joe Tai, wants you to believe, that's what he stated in his open letter, that this is all about the people in China who have been so offended, right? Really, all those people who were at the sold-out arenas that the Lakers and Nets played in, all those people who were on the streets of Shenzhen, China, Shanghai, China, who were treating the Lakers like they were the Beatles. LeBron James in the first game at Shanghai, right? Every time he touched the ball, I don't think I posted this video. Maybe I did. Every time he touched the ball, you know, when you look at the college basketball games and you know, the Dukies at Cameron Indoor Stadium, every time an opposing player to intimidate him touches the ball, touches the basketball in a Duke basketball game, the fans start to cheer to try to distract and intimidate. Well, it wasn't really an example of fans trying to intimidate, but to really cheer on a player. In the case of LeBron James earlier this week, when he played against the Nets in Shanghai, which was last Tuesday, I believe it was, LeBron James, every time he touched the ball in the Shanghai arena in front of this sold-out crowd, was cheered. I'm not making that up. That's exactly what was taking place. And so we're to believe, and in the secondary ticket market, on Chinese ticket broker websites, those Laker Nets tickets were going for up to 10 times face value, right? So we're to believe in a surveillance state like China, right, where, of course, the government is constantly filming you because there's cameras everywhere in China, that all of these people showed up knowing how the government had previously, before that first game, been condemning. They had been condemning the NBA, the teams. They were taking the banners down. They were removing the sponsorships. They were sanding off the sponsors off the hardwood of that NBA basketball court before the game. That was being done, right? But then all these people show up. It's because this is solely the function of the Chinese government. That's what's happening here. I'm really hammering this home. And I want to show you the stark contrast between the government and the people. It's extremely important. This type of government, this kind of authoritarian regime in China is a new phenomena. It's happened since 2012. This has not been a normal situation in China where you have a sort of totalitarianism overreaction that we saw from this government to the tweet by LeBron or by Daryl Morey, right? This is a new phenomenon. And the Chinese people clearly, well, first of all, they don't even know about it because they don't have Twitter. They only know what the government's telling them. And the government wants you to believe that Daryl Morey was suggesting that Hong Kong was fighting to become a sovereign nation. That's what that freedom thing meant in Morey's tweet when he said fight for freedom. The Chinese government wants you to believe Hong Kong is trying to break away and become independent, which is the biggest bunch of bull crap in history. Now, looking at Adam Silver's tweets, let's go back to those now. Now, they take on a different meaning because if anybody understands really going on, it's someone who was right in the middle of it all at the highest level, dealing with Chinese government apparatchiks throughout his trip. And of course, he was the target of their wrath when he was in China earlier this week. Adam Silver truly understands the situation more than anyone. And the relationship between the Chinese people, their actions, their responses, and the government and what they've been doing. Those are two very different things. So now let me read comment today at the Time Health Conference, Time Magazine. This is Adam Silver. I'm quoting him. Quote, I felt we had made enormous progress in building cultural exchanges with the Chinese people, and I have to regret that much of that is lost. I felt we had made enormous progress in building cultural exchanges with the Chinese people, and I regret that much of it has been lost. Really? It has been. I guess not for all the people that went to the games and followed LeBron James around in the streets and screamed his name and cheered every time he touched the ball. All those people. And the 1.4 million, I should say 1.4 billion Chinese who don't have Twitter, right? There was no cultural exchange when it came to the tweet from Daryl Morey to those people. They never saw the tweet. Of course, Morey has long since deleted it. Now, a lot of people on behalf of the Chinese government, who knows if they're actually Chinese, created accounts immediately and tweeted at Morey 200,000 tweets, trolls, right? But now when you look at the Adam Silver tweet, I should say comment that came out from that Time conference, the meaning looks much different. As if he doesn't understand that the so-called protests that were going on in China, that were the basis of the embargo in terms of sponsorship and casting, and of course the banners being taken down in relation to the NBA. If anybody knows the origin of it, the sole origin of it, it's Adam Silver. But in this comment, I felt we'd made enormous progress in building cultural exchanges with the Chinese people, but I regret that much of it is lost. No, he knows it's not lost. What he's doing there is pandering to the Chinese government. He is over deferential in that statement to the Chinese government. He is bowing and scraping to the Chinese government. A Chinese government, I might add, that runs Tencent, which is the streaming service that streams NBA games from the United States to China, United States and Canada, I might add, right? This company, Tencent, is the streaming company that broadcasts the games into China. 640 million Chinese, almost double our population in the United States, watch NBA games on Tencent, this streaming service, right? And guess what? Tencent has already rescinded the embargo on broadcast. One of the big parts of the initial sanctions against the NBA following the Mori tweet was to take down that streaming, right? Well, it's back up, except pockets. And of course, the government of the government that's supposed to be representing the Chinese people, but quite obviously doesn't, that government has been left hanging for an apology that it has demanded from Daryl Morey that's not coming. And so, I wonder if that has something to do with why the Rockets games still are not being streamed broadcast into China, despite the fact that, of course, that the Rockets are China's team, thanks to Yao Ming, who is the president of the Chinese Basketball Association, which is the answer to the NBA in China, and is a big financial enterprise over $1 billion. That league is worth $1.2 billion. And there were teams from that league, the CBA, that played against NBA teams in the preseason, and they continue to do so without incident, I might add, stateside, right? Well, I shouldn't say that. There were some incidents involving people holding Hong Kong, free Hong Kong signs in Washington, D.C. for a Wizards game against one of the teams in the Chinese basketball. Of course, those individuals were thrown out much like they would have been in China, right? So Adam Silver also says that the use of the term regrettable, he says this today, in the Chinese language tweet that went out to that country after Maury's tweet, was modifying the fact that we had upset our Chinese fans. So remember, after NBA, when this firestorm began and the government prompted all of these businesses to start to drop sponsorship temporarily, right, of NBA players and teams, and forced Tencent to stop broadcasting NBA games. That's what took place right after the Daryl Morey tweet, right? The NBA put out a response, a press release to the whole situation, and the press releases were dual in nature, and one of them was solely in the Chinese language. And it was that press release, right, that was deferential, that included the word, as Silver just said, regrettable. His tweet, regrettable. That's an apology. And now Silver accounts for that, saying, well, modifying the fact that we had upset our chance. Again, I just spent a few minutes showing you that the Chinese fans don't represent the Chinese government. Now, he may have been referring to fans because that's what that comment today from Adam Silver was based on. That's who it was, but not the 1.4 billion Chinese who are not part of the government, at least the people in that group that aren't part of the government. God knows it's probably a huge number of people who are employed or affiliated by the authoritarian regime. I don't even call it communism. Communism to me is a red herring. It's a distraction. It's irrelevant. So that's a pretty good rundown of what's happening. Now, we're going to talk later on to Ben Strauss of the Washington Post, and he has some information about ESPN. Now, ESPN, as we have documented on this show earlier this week, has remember I talked about the company Tencent, right? Well, Tencent is the streaming company. It's like the Netflix, if you will, to a certain extent in China. And it is a company that relies on capital from the Chinese government, right? And ESPN content is streamed via a strategic agreement. That's what it's called, a strategic agreement between ESPN and Tencent into China. That's how the Chinese people, the 1.4 billion that we keep talking about, that number, that's how they get ESPN. They get ESPN through Tencent, right? The same Tencent that was shut down by the government, that shut down NBA broadcast, that has been now rescinded. And now there's NBA coverage and broadcast of games flowing back through China, thanks to Tencent, as is ESPN. So when you know that, and we know the response of the government of China to the Daryl Morey tweet, that, of course, brings pause when it comes to the content of ESPN. What's interesting about this story is, and this was reported by the blog Deadspin, is that the highest profile show of ESPN that is streamed through Tencent is a show that is shown only in China, and it involves Adrian Wojnarowski, the famous reporter, of course, breaking news for ESPN, who covers the NBA. So we've given you a pretty good picture of what's going on so far. Now we're going to shift gears and move over to college football and talk to John Walters, who's with The Athletic. And, of course, in the past, he's worked for numerous outlets, including Sports Illustrated. And he writes what is arguably, for my money, the best college football column out there these days. Hey, John, I can't thank you enough for joining us. Thanks so much.
Brooks, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for having me on today.
So, and I really wanted to compliment you. I haven't gotten a chance to on your bubble screen column that comes out after the weekend. It's just a phenomenal column, man. Congratulations on that.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's obviously a lot of time spent on this couch watching the games and just trying to keep track of everything that's going on. But it is fun. There's a lot of plates in the air, but you and I both like to talk about what's actually going on and hoping to cut through all the BS. And I try to do that with the column.
I think it's particularly important when you look at how television is so important. Television is so important to college football. And so that's what I think really underlines and heightens the importance and the resonance of what it is that you do. But I wanted to bring something up that was in that column that really hasn't been mentioned in the blogosphere or in the media. And, of course, as far as ESPN goes, why would it? But it's the Dabo Swinney incident that you mentioned the bubble screen column that took place during the Florida State game recently. Can you kind of outline what happened there involving Dabo Swinney?
Yes, sure. So Clemson led 28-0 over Florida State in Death Valley last Saturday, late in the first half. And to make it shorter, basically Clemson had 2 red zone opportunities in the final 2 minutes and came away with 0 points. The first time, it was because Dabo Swinney decided to go on 4th and goal from the 2. He tried that jumbo package with, I think it's Xavier Lawrence, who is a defensive end. Not only did they not get to the goal line, but Lawrence fumbled the ball anyway. So that was no points. A couple plays later, Florida State throws an interception. Clemson sees itself 4th and, I think, 2 from the 7-yard line. And Dabo says, you can hear him say, go for it. But then he changes his mind, calls a timeout, or maybe they were running out of clock. They bring in this kicker, B.T. Potter, who misses an easy 24-yard field goal. No doubt about that. And Dabo begins a tirade on the sideline. And he's sort of yelling at people in general, and then he squares in on this 5'10", 180-pound kicker. And Steve Levy and Brian Greasy are doing the word picture thing for us. They're explaining it. They're describing it. But they're almost pro Dabo on this. And what really the 2 things that were said is Steve Levy said, he told Potter to get packing, get away from me. And then Brian Greasy blew me away when he said, if you're going to do this in front of the home fans, in front of a national television audience, you better have another kicker lined up, which is not where I expected them to be going with that.
Yeah.
And that's when
Yeah.
I felt compelled to write.
So Dabo Sweeney goes off on this kicker, and Brian Greasy essentially says, "You're poisoning the well, Dabo, with this kicker because of this, brutal, emotional, I guess you could call it or refer to it, abuse." But Dabo Sweeney is a guy, John, who has a reputation being a coach that supposedly all of his players love. So that kind of flied in the face of that reputation. The state down led to believe is that guy, the kind of myth that's built up. And then additionally, eventually we go back to the Clemson Florida State game, and things had changed, right? And Dabo's trying to patch things up. Is that what happened?
After halftime, they had video of him like going up to the kicker and patting him and having a conciliatory word or two, and then Brian Greasy is speaking over that B-roll, saying this is what Dabo Swinney is the best at in college football, breaking guys down and then psychologically bringing them back up. And what I do is my job is not to I don't have to understand the entire context of everything. I'm a viewer. And if I don't see context, then that's the job of Brian Greasy and Steve Levy to provide context for me. That's what they're paid for. So I've gotten a lot of hate mail from Clemson viewers and fans, and I understand it, telling me I didn't understand all the background. But that's not my job. And that's like what Steve Levy and Brian Greasy are paid to do, provide context. And what I saw as a viewer was a coach who got a little cute at the end of the first half, got no red zone points out of 2 possessions within the 10-yard line, and decided to take it out on someone. And a few viewers or readers pointed out to me, well, the kid wasn't ready. And I would say, and I did the math on this, Dabo Swinney gets paid 600 times what BT Potter gets paid to be a part of a football game. Dabo basically makes, if you do an NFL check out of it, 15 games divided by 9 million or so is about $600,000 a game. I would say Potter's probably making $1,000 to $2,000 a game in tuition and needs. Okay, so that's just some background. But what he is doing is basically he's supposed to be ready for the 4th down call. The fact that he had to call timeout and or changed his mind tells me he's not ready. And then if you're going to take it out on the kicker for quote unquote not being ready, then you're just a hypocrite. And I think he went after the weakest link he could, which I have no respect for when you're bullying the weak kid. And also, we see this a lot in our country, that's not in sports. Hey, if it's working, stop arguing about character. Stop arguing about what's right and wrong. It's working for us. Clemson's the most successful college football team of the last year, obviously, one of 2 of the last 4 years. So nobody wants to hear, anybody who's a Clemson fan doesn't want to hear anything negative about Dabo. But I thought as a viewer who has no grudge against Clemson at all, I just thought it was a really bad look for him.
Right. And in the context of everything else that we know about Dabo off the field and some of his comments about compensation of players and the unbelievable hypocrisy, he is certainly the symbol of it. But what's really striking, I think, about this situation that really is insight into his character is what you mentioned earlier, that his object of derision isn't Trevor Lawrence. It's not Travis Etienne, and it wouldn't be, even if they made a bonehead play. Or I don't know. I'm asking you, do you think that if Trevor Lawrence had made a bonehead play or missed an obvious something on a play, that Dabo would have had that response?
I doubt it. And people have pointed out that BT Potter, the kicker, is 5 for 9 on field goals this year, which obviously isn't very good. But the point is, Dabo set himself up by trying to get too cute with a fullback or a defensive end running the ball in the first half. That was, I mean, you know what? That's the one honest thing that Steve Levy said, and I opened the column with it. Was he maybe a little bit too cute there, Grease? He was, and as much as I want to fault Dabo for this, I would also fault the ESPN announcers for this. You know what? Because you're basically sounding like a homer for who's ever the popular coach at the time. It's very easy for ESPN to be in love with Dabo Swinney and Clemson's program right now. And it needs to be mentioned, I don't care if it matters or not, that Kirk Herbstreit, who's the most influential on-air person in college football, maybe even off-air for ESPN, has 2 twin sons playing on that football team. And that casts a shadow. Whether or not Kirk ever says a single word about it, he is the most influential person related to college football at ESPN. Anyone who's at ESPN knows that. I just thought it was a bad look for Steve Levy and Brian Griese, because if this was another coach and another team, I believe that an objective analyst and play-by-play announcer would be pointing out what to me were very obvious things to see.
Yeah, interesting. You also, in addition to looking at the television coverage, I read in your column, there's a lot of things that you talk about in relation to what's going on necessarily off camera. And you mentioned Justin Murphy, the football player at Houston, who now has gone on Twitter. And of course, this is what really, really, really bothers me about the media and the conflict of interest that is so overwhelming and profound. And of course, you probably the biggest one, Herbstreit's twin sons being a member of the team, and that's never brought up. I mean, if it is, it's brought up on background for the most part. It's almost like everybody's kind of in on it to a certain extent, tacitly. But Justin Murphy is a football player, I guess former football player now at the University of Houston, a 6th-year transfer who's had 3 knee surgeries. He's a senior. And so what exactly took place with him? I guess it was a function of social media.
Yes, he got on Twitter last Friday or Thursday, I believe, and there was a thread, and you can follow it if you look for his name on Twitter, where he basically outlines that this entire redshirt issue going on at the University of Houston, which De'Ara King, the quarterback who's star of the team and a wide receiver, took advantage of, was offered to other players. But basically it's not a fair situation, because if everybody decides to redshirt who's a senior, first of all, you're leaving the other players on the team out in the cold. Second of all, this is a commercial product. You have sold season tickets to fans. Do they get to redshirt their ticket sales? I don't think so. I don't think anybody who has a Houston Cougar season ticket gets to say, I paid for those games that De'Ara King was in. I don't want to have to pay for the rest of the season. So you are pulling back the product that you promised your fans. And when this all happened a few weeks ago originally, I applaud College Game Day for making it an open forum discussion. But what happened was, and you see this all the time, a few of the bigger names on the show, well, I spoke to Dana Holgerson last night, and he explained it to me. And David Pollack was the one man on that show who came out and said, this does not pass the smell test for me. And it never passed the smell test for me, and it probably doesn't pass the smell test for you, because you're basically saying some players are more equal than others. Even though you all get the same financial package, the good guys, I'm going to save this for next season. So as a coach, I'm almost like, re-recruiting my next season.
I mean, it's outrageous. It's outrageous. Yeah.
And you're leaving these other guys on the team to have to face this schedule without their best players, because someone has to show up, and they don't have the option that De'Ara King has. So it's a terrible message to send your program. Terrible values. We always hear about these life lessons these coaches are teaching. What kind of life lesson? If it gets hard, you can quit, but only if you're good enough to quit. That's a terrible life lesson to teach someone.
How many times in college sports have you heard coaches talk about seniors? It's all about the seniors.
Right.
The season is dedicated to the freaking seniors.
Right.
And here we have a guy telling seniors, a 6th-year graduate transfer who's had 3 knee surgeries, to take a red shirt, and all of these other, the best player on the team, De'Ara King, take a red shirt.
Right.
And what about, as you just talked about, the seniors, everybody else that's participating? It's the NFL. And if this isn't the number one commentary that you could make about how broken this system is and how disgraceful it is, I think it's this situation. And of course, this is a function of the media glossing it over. I talked to Dana Holgerson. So all of the guys on College Game Day talked to the coach.
They didn't talk to the players.
Right.
Right.
It's
Well, that's why I love what David Pollack had to say. And actually, like that week, I read the column about how here's finally someone speaking truth to power. And I really respect David Pollack. And I'm sure you've spoken to these guys. I've spoken to Desmond Howard and Kirk Herbstreit. They're smart men. They're not stupid. And Desmond is usually very blunt, especially when it comes to like talking about his own alma mater. I was shocked that, well, two things happened on that episode. I was shocked that they would just say, well, I talked to Dana and he said it's okay. Like, very Neville Chamberlain of them to do that. The second thing that happened that day was they did this roundtable, what's wrong with Michigan football? And they went through Desmond, Kirk, Lee Corso. It finally got to David Pollack, who finally mentioned the H word. Like, the other three guys had never mentioned that maybe Jim Harbaugh is wrong. What's wrong with Michigan football? It took Pollack to say, like, there's a big elephant in the room that none of you want to say on camera. And as a viewer, I don't like it when I feel like I'm getting, BS'd.
Well, and we're talking to John Walters, eminent reporter, writer for The Athletic, and longtime guy who's been covering sports and college sports. A tremendous Twitter account to follow, JDubs, JDUBS 88 on Twitter. You're definitely going to want to follow him. And you brought up, and we've been talking about some of the embargoing of reality, if you will. And of course, that really captures college football, I think, in one sentence. But what about something that could be groundbreaking and earth-shattering in its extent on college football and its influence, and that is this fair pay to play law that's come out of the state of California. And that relates to UCLA, Stanford, Cal, USC, possibly those college football players being compensated for endorsements. What was the response that you saw of this, what could be a huge development in college football, on the coverage that we saw the subsequent Saturday?
Well, I thought it was interesting that it did not come up at all on either
Shocking.
College Game Day or Fox's Big Noon Kickoff. I watched both shows beginning to end. That's 4 hours of coverage. Was not mentioned once. And I talked to an ESPN official behind the scenes who said that beforehand, I'm sure they're going to discuss in the pre-production meeting, decide whether or not to put it on air. They did not. They just, they took a mulligan on having to discuss this. But here's the irony of it all, is on that same Saturday, while you're watching men who make hundreds of thousands, if not a seven-figure salary, talking about college football, if that's not enough, in between those airings, you're seeing commercials in which Kirk Herbstreit and Maria Taylor and Reese Davis and Lee Corso and Desmond Howard appear. So they are literally profiting off their likeness as college football personalities during their own show. And Rob Stone and Matt Leinart also have something where they appear for Wendy's. So the hypocrisy inherent, if you had been talking about that on College Game Day, would have been just monumental. And I think that's, to me, the reason they didn't go and even explore it. Because either you're going to sound like a hypocrite by saying it's dangerous, well, then we break to a commercial and you're showing up for Pizza Hut or Home Depot, or you come out in favor of it, and now you're stepping on some toes in Indianapolis that are a little upset, or maybe, and that may extend to Bristol. So it was a no-win situation because of how these big name personalities have already exploited the same system that California is finally allowing for the college athletes.
Yeah, it takes an outlier like the California Assembly, a political outlier, extraordinary in its demographic makeup right now, political party makeup, to affect this change, and it does so kind of out of the mainstream. I will say this, John, and I'm sure it did come up in the pre-production meeting, but I'm not so sure they look at it the way you look at it, and I look at it, the brazen hypocrisy and irony of it. I'm not so sure they look at it that way. They probably just don't see a lot of entertainment value in it.
That's exactly right. They don't see the entertainment value of it. We're just we're just here to entertain people. We're not journalists unless it pays for us to look and sound like journalists, obviously. But for me, it was, I'm looking at it maybe differently than, the housewife who wants to see the next Tom Rinaldi piece that makes her cry. So I will grant you that maybe my eyes and your eyes are a little different in what we're looking for out of that program. But that is true. But this comes back to the money is so silly. Last Saturday, when South Carolina beat Georgia, and they interviewed South Carolina coach Will Muschamp on the sideline, and they asked him what the victory meant for him. I don't know if you remember watching that. I know you're a Georgia, follower. Yeah. And he said, it doesn't mean anything for me. And I'm so skeptical at this point that I went online to try to find out if there was a performance bonus in his contract for beating Georgia. I don't think there was. I didn't find one. But that's where you could have literally gone back and said, actually, it did mean maybe it meant $80,000 for you. The USA Today just yesterday, I'm sure you saw it, printed out like the bonuses that coaches have, incentive bonuses that college football coaches have already earned this year. And that's where, as a fan or as anyone who wants to defend the system as is, you just see this is how much money is out there and how silly it is that they can still hide behind this amateur sham when not only are coaches being paid millions of dollars a year, but they're getting $100,000 incentive bonuses for doing their job. Just doing their job. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it truly is endemic. It truly is woven into the fabric of our culture. When you look at college football, and again, I keep going back to it, it takes a complete, total non sequitur outlier that blindsides everybody. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not being acknowledged. And I will say the fact that that law doesn't go into effect until 2023, that's a big deal. And who's to say that there'll be litigation? Because I'm not necessarily positive that it will, because I think we're starting to see hints from Mark Emmert and company that maybe they're not going to surrender, but they're going to make it appear as if they're going to surrender and perhaps try to put this rule in there that's going to cheat the athletes again. But what's your thought on that?
I thought it was interesting that, like you said, they're waiting until 2023 because it's sort of like, we're not going to hit you with a tidal wave. We are going to hit you with an asteroid that we can all see is coming from way far out. And we're going to give you time to adjust to this and figure out how you are going to, maneuver your own organization. What was interesting about the act and the wording of it is that it says the NCAA cannot prohibit these schools or these athletes from appearing in competition because of doing this. So they are telling a private organization how it can run and operate, which I found interesting. And I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how that would work out in a court. Basically, a law being passed on a state level to tell a federal or national private institution what they can and cannot do. But I think the NCAA, hopefully, and maybe this part of this 4-year outlier was to see how's the public reaction? How's that going to work? Or do we have better ideas? I talked to one booster who made an interesting point, and he said, schools, if it came to this, schools would rather pay athletes directly than have boosters paying athletes, because then they control the money. And for whatever good or bad you may think it will be, the nice idea of telling, I don't know, let's say a famous athlete right now in California, let's say Michael Pittman, the wide receiver from USC. It's nice to say, you know what, if there's a Los Angeles-based car dealership that wants to pay you $10,000 for appearing in an ad, that's great. But we all know that's not where it stops. From there, it goes to big-name boosters who would rather spend $1 million on endowing a quarterback position than helping build a science lab, because they can talk to their friends in the Caymans or in Hawaii about that. So you would actually have this potential shift of power where schools like Harvard and Yale could become players again in college football. The irony of that.
Yeah.
After 150 years, hey, guess what, Yale? You matter again because you have a gigantic endowment and you have boosters who want to see your school be big again. Yale could become a top 5 school in 10 years if it wanted to.
Boy, that's fascinating. Yeah, great point.
But that's what scares, I think, the status quo power structure, because all of a sudden Alabama might not be Alabama anymore if you could pay kids, because there are other schools with more money, more endowment.
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us, John. I really appreciate you jumping on. Great job on the column. Thanks so much.
Brooks, thank you very much for having me on. I'll listen all the time. I appreciate it.
That's John Walters with The Athletic. Also has a website called Medium Happy, and he updates that website, I might add. You just heard him. Was I right about this guy? Tremendous. That guy should be on TV. John Walters. But he has a website called Medium Happy, one word, and he does a daily update on it about current events called It's All Happening. And he writes the bubble screen on The Athletic, which to me is worth a subscription alone. That's how good it is. I mean, it's extremely long. It's a little bit like kind of a media-centric version of Peter King's, of course, famous now Monday morning quarterback column, but that's about the NFL. But so John Walters, tremendous writer, didn't get a chance to talk to him. We'll have him back, absolutely. And didn't get a chance to talk to him about Sports Illustrated. And he is a longtime staffer at Sports Illustrated. And man, now that I think about it, we should have. But we've got another guest coming up here in short order. Coming up as far as guests are concerned overall, Ben Strauss of the Washington Post will talk about what we talked about in the outset of the show about the situation involving the NBA, Daryl Morey, and now we have new comments coming out from Adam Silver earlier today that nobody's going to analyze, and really gave insight into exactly what he was trying to say in the brief they are and were earlier today at that Time Magazine Health Conference. Coming up, we're going to be Peter Burns. In fact, why don't we bring him up now, Cam? Peter Burns of the SEC Network, as we talked Pac-12 football with John Wilner yesterday, and now we're going to look at the SEC with Peter Burns. And hey, Peter, how's it going,
What's
man?
up, Brooks? How you doing, bud? It's kind of crazy how we're talking Pac-12 kind of back in it. Remember, I think it was kind of buried, left for dead a couple of weeks ago, and here we are, a couple of big games this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. And Oregon continues to hang in there. I mean, what is your thought? I mean, because obviously being with the SEC Network, the start of the season involved Oregon and Auburn. We get the result of that game on the Auburn side, but Oregon's looking better and better.
Yeah, I mean, just the way that Cristobal has put that team together. And I was thinking about that before we got on today. I'm like, you know what? Let's say we flip it. Let's say that Auburn doesn't score that last-second touchdown to beat Oregon early in the year. Where do we have Oregon ranked? Right? I mean, like the way that they've been dominant, they would have had a good top 25 victory against Auburn. So we would have looked at that completely different. And I'm like, man, can one play really kind of change, an entire perception of a conference? And frankly, it did, right? For like 3-4 weeks, we kind of looked at the Pac-12 like, all right, they don't matter anymore, and unfortunately that's been the case over the last couple of years. But I mean, I go back and look. I think the Pac-12 right now, Brooks, is right there with the Big 12 as far as overall depth. I know it's a lot farther than where the ACC is right now, so it might be the third biggest or best conference as far as top to bottom football being played.
Yeah, and nothing speaks to the problematic nature of the college football playoff. The fact that they're not even part of the conversation. It's and the fact that they've proven with their game against Auburn, at the very least, they are competitive with the SEC. But now when you look at the progress of Oregon, I don't think there's any doubt that this team deserves to play a conversation. I mean, what's your thought right now on the state of the playoff and the potential of an expansion at some point?
Well, I mean, I think there's no doubt that it expands, right? A couple of years ago, and I talked to Bill Hancock, I'd say, hey, where are we at on expansion? And he would just laugh. He goes, there's no talk. Like, he just kind of laughed it off. And lately, when I talked to him, I asked where we're at, and he goes, well, we're always talking. And the fact that he would just literally say that, Brooks, the fact that he would admit that, hey, we're always kind of, talking behind the scenes makes me think, it's going to eventually happen. And I think that when the college football playoff contract ends, and I think 2024, they'll eventually expand at some point. Now, the question is, will it be 6? Will it be 8? Will it be automatic conference, bids, which I hope is not the case. That is to be determined. But again, right now, I like the fact that we have 4 teams because I think it puts an onus on the teams to play those Auburn-type Oregon games or LSU versus Texas or Georgia versus Notre Dame. Like, hey, push comes to shove, you should get the bid opposed to a team that's going to play some AA squad or some FCS opponent.
Visiting with Peter Burns, of course, ESPN's SEC network. Let's talk about the SEC now. My alma mater, University of Georgia, and a catastrophic loss, I guess, with the way the college football playoff works and the SEC strength throughout the league. Perhaps not. We'll have to wait and see how that Georgia-Florida game works out. But you mentioned, I saw on your Twitter feed and on your daily talk show, that Georgia's fix is extremely simple. And when I saw that, that's a great.
It's a good tease, right?
Yeah, it's a great tease to get people to listen. But tell us what that is.
Honestly, it's to go back and go look at what Aaron Rodgers had to deal with a couple of years ago with the Packers, right? Remember when everybody was freaking out that the Packers weren't good? He's just told about everybody, RELAX, relax, right? And I honestly think, Brooks, your alma mater school right now is just really uptight. And it's just the way that Kirby is. What makes Kirby a great recruiter, Brooks, is the fact that he will go into your room and it is nonstop. He will pummel you. This is going to be the greatest thing. Georgia's going to be awesome. We're going to do this. We got this, this, and this. And there's so much passion. Hell, you can't help but say, yeah, I'm a 5-star. I want to commit down to Athens. The problem is with him is that I think the whole crew is wound up that way. And I think when things don't go correctly, I think all of a sudden everybody's scared to make a mistake. You know, I've been there in practice, and Kirby, I tell you what, he gets those guys running hard. Like it's like Nick Saban light, in the fact of when your parent, you know, whenever your team is worried about what coach is going to say, even when things are going correctly. So I think for him, the easiest thing to do is, and he'll never do it, is to call Dan Mullen and go, how the hell are you so calm and collected on the sidelines? Like, you seem like you're having fun. Like, Dan doesn't have the athletes that Georgia has. Dan doesn't have the athletes at Florida that LSU had. But guess what? They went toe-to-toe because every time I'd see Dan had a plan, and he was chill. And when it didn't work, he goes, okay, well, let's do this. It wasn't just, you know, flying by the seat of his pants. So I love Kirby Smart, the recruiter. And you got to have the Jimmies and Joes right now. But him and James Coley and everybody need to relax, have a little bit more fun, go back to basics and say, you know what? You're a 5-star kid. Let's go back like it's Pop Warner football, and let's go have some fun and make some plays. And I think right now they're just way too tight.
I think something that might also be contributing to that, and maybe this happens perhaps with Clemson and in Alabama at times, they don't play a lot of close games. And so you're not in those situations that often.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely hurt Alabama last year, right? I mean, you know, when they finally got into a fist fight with Clemson, and once they got hit, they're like, wait, my nose hasn't been bloodied all season long, and they weren't quite ready for it. So, I mean, for me, I look at it more, and they had that game, right? I mean, the Notre Dame game was close, so they at least had some type of hey, we've been backs up against the wall. How are we going to respond? I think what it is, and Kirby even talked about it this week, on one of the radio interviews he did before the game. He did a pregame interview with radio, and he says, my guys aren't ready to play right now. I got to go out there and get them ready to go. And for Kirby to say that, I thought was telling, because I think what it is, Brooks, is he thought that, hey, we're a bunch of 5-star guys. That team kind of felt like they could just roll out and out-athlete everybody. And guess what? Will Muschamp was having none of that, and that's the reason why that they had that horrifically bad, upset 24-point underdog loss.
We're visiting with Peter Burns of the SEC Network, and of course your alma mater, LSU, a big win over Florida. I'm not all that excited about the win, even though Florida played very well, played much better than I thought they would. But I've been fascinated with your approach about LSU. Of course, D-Day right now is November 9, Alabama and LSU. And do you remain unconvinced about that LSU defense?
Yeah, but here's one thing that I've kind of understood, and it took me a week or two to get there. How much does it matter in the grand scheme of things that the defense is not that great? And the reason why I say that is because right now LSU and Alabama are going, yeah, we've got issues on defense. We get it. But does it matter, right? Like it's basically the first to 48 every single week, and they feel like they can do it. I mean, Florida had a pretty darn good defense, right? Top 10, even though Grenard was a little bit banged up and so was Zuniga, but they've got C.J. Henderson. They've got some capable defensive players, and Todd Grantham's a good D coordinator. It didn't matter. Joe Burrow went 21-24. Basically, both LSU and Alabama are sitting there, Brooks, going, well, we're going to score 90% or 75% of the time we get the ball. You're going to be able to keep up? So all they need to do is get 2 or 3 stops right now. And I mean, amazing to think 2011 was a 9-6 game, and now we're looking at it might be 90-60, in Tuscaloosa. And as much as I love what LSU is doing right now, until I see it, I still pick Alabama in those games just because of the way Nick Saban continues to never let his guard down, and especially when he's over at home.
Well, tell me what your breakdown is of Joe Burrow. Is this guy really as transcendent as he looks? And is this something that could be reflected in the Heisman voting? Could this game really determine that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the one everybody has circled going, all right, as long as we don't see just some horrifically bad performance like Trevor Lawrence had against North Carolina a couple of weeks ago, as long as we don't see that, I'm not worried about what Burrow and Tua are going to do until they face off in Tuscaloosa. And I think in a weird way, man, it sucks for Tua because Tua is putting up even better numbers than he did last year, and no one gives a rat's ass. Really, nobody.
No, wait. Really? Because what I see is everybody still has Tua at the top, and Burrow hasn't gotten the credit he deserves.
Yeah, but it's almost as if like Tua is just, we'll put Tua up there. Like the whole story right now this year is Joe Burrow, and I can't believe he's there and he's right at the top. And in a weird way that I think if the numbers are almost identical at this point, they would give it to Burrow because it's such a more interesting story than giving it to Tua because that's what they've come to understand that Tua is so great. And that's not fair to Tua, who by all accounts is even better than he was last year. And by this point, we were talking about him being one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time and the numbers they were putting up. His numbers this year are astronomical, like compared to they were better this year. So again, it sucks that boring Bama is boring Bama. And I say boring just because they're so good. Like you can literally go do your groceries and your grocery shopping and just go, all right, well, when is the LSU game? Because that's all that matters right now to Tide fans.
Yeah. Well, what about Jalen Hurts? Is he still in this conversation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for Hurts, the bad interceptions, right? Bad turnovers in that game against Texas, Brooks. And I think that was the biggest concern that I have is just don't lose a game. And he's going to be able to put up monster numbers. But right now, again, it's a sprint between Tua and Burrow, and I don't see any of them really getting caught up right now. And so for Hurts has to have some of these like just monstrosity games where it's like 500 yards of total offense. And he could do that potentially in the Big 12. But I still think I think the other one that you have to talk about is Justin Fields. Fields probably 4th, maybe 5th, along with Jonathan Taylor. But if Fields can go up against a Wisconsin defense in a couple of weeks and when they face and shred that Badgers defense, which has been all world so far, that adds a little fly into the ointment.
Visiting with Peter Burns of SEC Network, a guy that we've been talking about throughout the season. I want to get your impressions of Gus Malzahn, his situation in general, and your response to how he's handling. I mean, look, they were flying high, but did Florida really tell you something about maybe he told me something that maybe he doesn't have the grasp that he necessarily needs on this team to perhaps
I think
survive?
It's more of it just told me, Brooks, that you had a true freshman quarterback, and when you're dealing with a really good quality team, they're going to make you pay. You can get by other squads, but you can't just grind it week in and week out and not expect to get caught sooner or later. So I will tell you this. I like Gus is like Ryan Howard in baseball, right? It's either home run or strike out. And this year they probably are going to have to play the role of a spoiler just because of how good everyone else is. The defense is solid. I go back and look at the other part of it too. Who else is out there that would do a better job than what Gus Malzahn's doing at Auburn? For people that always say, it's Gus and here he's going to lose a bunch of games.
Tony Elliott.
Are we sure?
Tony Elliott.
And that's,
we don't know, but I just look at Gus. Here's the thing. I look at Gus on the sidelines. This is ridiculous to say. Yeah. This is a fan thing, but the guy was just out of control, overreacting. And Dan Mullen is the ultimate contrast, right? And I think we saw it even more so at LSU as an example of Dan Mullen's been around a long time. I'm not saying Gus Malzahn won't, but when you have a freshman quarterback and you're in that environment, and that's what that was my response watching that game, that it was just as telling what Gus was doing on the sidelines as it was necessarily on the field.
No, I mean, because
it's
not fair for me to rip Kirby Smart for being too theatrical and too involved in it and not say the same thing about Gus. And I think Gus understood that. I mean, we talked to Gus this week, and Gus says, hey, I got to do a better job of keeping my team, and especially a freshman, in putting him in spots to have success. And I think that's what caught up with them. I mean, Auburn had a huge game. I think it was against Mississippi State, in which, Auburn, and Bo Nix threw for 300 yards. And I think Gus thought all of a sudden, okay, he turned the corner. We got, he's got 4 games underneath his belt. Let's let him rip against Florida. And it came out to bite him. So I think, I think they're in a tough spot now because they lose Boobie Whitlow, their running back, who really was the catalyst for that team. It's like A&M losing Travion Williams. It's monsters. So that's why this game, in a weird way, against Arkansas this week, is something I want to see from Gus, because he's undefeated all time as a head coach at Auburn coming off of a bye. So he normally does a pretty good job of, looking into his team, investigating what the issues are. So I don't want to see, if I'm an Auburn fan, I like Gus, I don't want to see a 14-point victory. I want to see a convincing, 35-point shellacking in Fayetteville on the road to believe, hey, listen, we're still in this SEC West.
Well, obviously, in the SEC, you get the get-out-of-jail-free card of the SEC championship game, and that might be the case. It usually is this season as we look towards the college football playoff. So in the case of Georgia, what I wanted to ask you about was this Florida team, as it relates to Georgia, as it relates to Kyle Trask specifically, because the LSU defense, was that a function of Kyle Trask playing well? How good is Kyle Trask in this Florida team, and what do you see playing out between those two?
Yeah, right now I actually like the Florida Gators more than, or I trust the Florida Gators more than I trust the Georgia Bulldogs, just because I think they have dudes on this defense, man. And I think that's the one thing that Georgia has decent players, but they don't have that next level guys like Grenard and Zuniga, if they were able to stay healthy. Listen, it's kind of in a weird way, and it sucks for Felipe Franks. He's a good kid, right? But Kyle Trask fits better for what Florida wants to do. Like LSU, Florida, had Franks been the quarterback, I don't think that game's close. But Trask just finds ways to make it work, and he's a damn gamer. So you combine that with the fact of, I think Dan Mullen is as good at X's and O's right now. I think that right now you're going to find that if Florida could stick with LSU's offense, they damn sure should be able to stick with Georgia. So unless I see something crazy this weekend that makes me change my mind, I definitely lean towards the Florida Gators in that matchup in Jacksonville.
Last question for you. Of course, Tennessee is going to have to go through this gauntlet now on its schedule. I mean, what do you think plays? I mean, it's going to be a really tough situation. But now we've seen Tennessee play against a lot of different types of opponents. And what's your real assessment of that team? What kind of team really is this? Is this a competitive
team, Brooks? Because I see enough talent on there. The thing is I don't think Jeremy Pruitt went in to Knoxville last year and even this year fully knowing how to work with that team, right? I mean, he's a product of Nick Saban, and just like Kirby Smart came in there and he was going to be kind of the disciplinarian and try to get everything ready to go. Well, they have some characters on that team that have some talent, but don't necessarily row the boat in the same direction, right? And so I think that team was a little lost and weren't buying into Jeremy Pruitt. And Nigel Warrior, one of their players, had a great quote this week that said defensive coaches came up to this week and said, hey, let's play like it's Pop Warner football. Remember that kid that used to go out there and just enjoy playing football? Let's go do that. Yeah. And that was the first time I saw Pruitt have a little bit more fun, that the guys flew around, they stopped the ball, they ran the ball with a passion. So there's talent. That's why it's been so frustrating for Vol fans, is to think, well, hell, man, we should be able to do this. But ultimately, when I talked to Pruitt this week, he says, I wish I had 15 guys on defense, and I'm not sure if 15 guys on defense could stop Tua. Yeah. So it's going to be another long one for him this weekend.
Would you be shocked? Well, you said it's going to be another long one. Would you be shocked if they put a game together against a really good one of these really good opponents coming up where they're competitive, or do you think there's no chance?
Yeah, I mean, like Arkansas doesn't have a lot of talent. Vanderbilt does not have a lot Tennessee is not like that, though. Tennessee actually has talent. They got to put it together. So, yeah, can they run with a couple of drives? Sure. I mean,
but
Alabama,
it's a Georgia game situation, in other words.
Yeah, and I don't even think it's that. Right. I mean, I
Okay.
think that for now, I mean, here's the last thing I'll leave with you for Tennessee. I think a lot of it had to do with the coaching search that was done previously, and the Schiano and all the stupid protests and stuff like that. I think that really hurt recruiting, and combined that the when Pruitt took over, that was the first year they had early signing days. So by the time he had already landed, there wasn't all right. We got a month and a half to get recruits in. All the recruits basically were gone. So he was basically a full year even behind schedule on recruiting. So. Again, I still think it's probably 2021 until we can talk about if Jeremy Pruitt at Tennessee worked. And I do think that he'll build a foundation there. It's just a matter of that going to be quick enough for Vol fans.
You are the best, man. This is great information. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Peter.
Anytime for you, bud. See ya.
That's Peter Burns of the SEC Network. And again, as I was saying early in the show, between him and John Walters, you're getting extra there. You're getting more. And I'm one of those guys that when I watch college football, this is just in my blood. I'm a college football scoreboard guy. And really, there's no real justification for it other than, I grew up in an era where there was no concept of a playoff. It was always a beauty contest. And the field, in a sense, mattered more than it does today. The great irony is and we let off the conversation with Peter about Oregon, and I think that that's a crystallization of what is wrong with the college football playoff, is that Oregon, number one, it's also ironic when you look at the high-profile nature of that Oregon program, the fact that its ranking is so low is, as this is a beauty contest, because ultimately everything is based on rankings, everything is based on subjectivity, and what humans think of you. This is not like the NFL, where you have this systematic, standardized scheduling system and this playoff setup. No, it's very different still, even though we have this kind of a semblance of a playoff in college football. You got to start somewhere at the beginning of the year. That matters. And if you're the Pac-12 or the ACC and you're not Clemson, but the Pac-12 is a great example right now, because they right now are unmoored. If you think about the Big 12, obviously they've got a lot of also-rans in that conference. They're anchored by Texas and primarily Oklahoma. So as long as those teams are there, I think that other schools are going to get consideration. But Oklahoma and Texas is more likely themselves to get consideration in early polling or in polling and voting in general. Same thing goes for the ACC. The ACC is literally off the map. It's nowhere without Clemson. Clemson is the anchor. It's the flagship of that conference. It's keeping that conference above water, essentially, right now, at least in football. But when you look at the Pac-12, they don't have that luxury up in Oregon. Right? And Oregon's not that program. Oregon doesn't have that reputation. Clearly, Oregon is the best team in the Pac-12. And it's very unfortunate for Oregon that there was a loss there to Auburn at the beginning of the season. And I think that loss is only going to get worse because of the schedule that Auburn's got to play. Auburn's got to play Georgia. They got to play LSU. And they've got to play Alabama this year. So when I mention Gus Malzahn, you really have to mention him in the context of, is he going to be coaching next year? Because that's really the issue at Auburn. You may not hear that in the media coverage, but that's what it comes down to. And I think it was a very bad sign, the way they lost. First of all, it's a game that they've got to win that game. Is Auburn a 4-5 loss team? Well, Auburn fans will tell you, no, we're not in that category. Well, you sure are. You're there. And what makes you think it's going to get any better after this year? Bo Nix is, I mean, I think that there has been a little bit of excitement about him because of the victory at Texas A&M, which again doesn't look all that great at this point. Texas A&M has been a disappointment this season. The win over Oregon, Mississippi State is his big game, and Mississippi State isn't exactly a team. They lost everybody on defense. So I could go on and on about the SEC, but we're going to shift gears now. If we get the opportunity and visit with Ben Strauss of the Washington Post, who's really at the forefront, I think, of giving us some background on what's going on in terms of the ESPN coverage of the NBA and China in particular. And he's got a lot of background in that area, having landed a one-on-one with Jimmy Pitaro, which really, I think, informs his coverage and takes his coverage to the next level. So we'll talk to Ben Strauss here in a bit, as we're also talking about college football quite a bit. And I was analyzing the Auburn situation with Gus Malzahn. And my whole point to Peter, and man, you talk about great information in terms of his analysis of a guy like Kirby Smart, and the fact that he's been to the practices and he's willing to make those statements, despite the fact, of course, the SEC's network, the SEC network, the ESPN, their bread is buttered by their relationship broadcast-wise with these schools and the coaches. It tells you about the relationships that are deep between Peter and these coaches. And we know he told a story last time he was on with us a couple of weeks ago about his relationship with Will Muschamp that has really stayed with me. And had I had more time, I was going to talk to him about Will Muschamp and that win by South Carolina over Georgia. But he really takes it to the next level and gives you some extra insight there. But my impression of Gus Malzahn in that game against, I just didn't have control. And because he was so demonstrative on the sidelines in his overreaction, right? With Bo Nix in particular, you're talking about an 18-year-old. I hate the word kid, and I do it. Everybody does it. But that's endemic to college sports because of the paternalism that's used to justify not compensating those players. That's a little psychological thing, I believe, that's going on. An 18-year-old young man, Bo Nix, right? You can't, to me, unless you have a really extraordinary person who's 18 years old, you can't conduct yourself that way. And he was borderline out of control in that loss to Florida. And I understand he made some calls on plays and called some plays, and they were there. There were opportunities. There were receivers open for Auburn. But when Bo Nix didn't make those throws, and nothing could be more predictable than an 18-year-old missing throws in that environment at the Swamp in Gainesville, Gus should know better to do that. So that was my big takeaway from that game. And that was such a critical, important game. I understand why it would be upset, but that's what a coach does. He is a reflection of the team. He has to be a mirror of the team. And Dan Mullen, who was on the other sideline that day for Florida and now was on the sideline against LSU last Saturday, coaches, and I'm doing it right now. And that's one of the things I don't like about college football. It's not enough about the players, and it should be. Of course, we talked about Dabo earlier. But there's been a lot of talk from the media about how Kyle Trask played in particular at LSU. And here's a guy that, came out of nowhere as the quarterback for Florida and doesn't have a deep background playing that position. But I think the fact that he played as well as he did against maybe a defense that isn't all that great, at least in terms of LSU standards, but the fact that his best game came at LSU in that extraordinary environment, in a sport of extraordinary environments, LSU is at the very top. The Trask pulled that off in the way that he did at the quarterback position. And then, of course, you've got the opposite in temperament on that Florida sideline with Dan Mullen, and nothing proves it more than his conduct in Baton Rouge last Saturday. I think it just shows you what's possible. Because Florida, their talent level certainly isn't where you would think it would be as the flagship school and the reputation they have for football. It's not there yet. Dan Mullen isn't necessarily a great recruiter either. That's not something that he's been known for over the years, but he is known for coaching them up. That's how he got that job at Florida, through keeping Mississippi State relevant all those years, year after year. Is that going to work? I mean, there are a lot of coaches out there, and we see it in every sport. Brad Stevens is a great example, I think, of the Boston Celtics right now. He may be kind of the Dan Mullen of the NBA. Dan Mullen has done extremely well at schools like Mississippi State, where the talent level wasn't expected to be all that great, right? But he was able to keep Mississippi State in the upper half of that conference, which in the history of that program, despite, fits and starts here where they do extremely well over a short period of time, he gave them at Mississippi State the longest sustained success that program and that school has ever seen in college football. And I'm not so sure people really recognize what an achievement that is. But he did it with less talent. Now he's in a place where the best talent is available if you recruit, if you're focused on that, if your personality, like Kirby Smart at Georgia, right, matches up with that, interfaces with that. And so far, Dan Mullen hasn't been blowing anybody away at Florida. So does that mean that we're going to get the same kind of result year after year from the Gators that he did at Mississippi State, fair to Midland, upper half? Well, that's not acceptable. It still remains to be seen. Recruiting is what's really going to matter for a guy like Dan Mullen, whereas at Georgia, it's the opposite. We know Kirby Smart is a premier savant recruiter, right? Can he do what Dan Mullen is so good at Florida? Can he manage a game? That's going to be the key. My point about Brad Stevens was great, when no one was expecting anything. When they had the injury to Kyrie early on in Kyrie's career with the Celtics, Brad Stevens takes them to the brink of the NBA Finals. Kyrie comes back. They've got a lot more talent, and the roof collapses on that team. So that's really what I was referring to. And there's a lot of coaches out there that thrive in that underdog environment, or more specifically, thrive with teams that don't have overwhelming talent or talent that's expressed in just one or two players. And so it's an interesting study when you look at the difference between a Dan Mullen and a guy like Kirby Smart, where Kirby Smart he's in a job and he's in an industry where recruiting is pretty much 90% of that job. It just is, right? It just is. And I think it's really underlined when you see how crappy, the schools in the ACC particularly are. I mean, that the teams in garbage, they're awful. And it's because they're not getting great players, so they can't paper over the poor coaching. Coaching is the most overrated element in sports, particularly football, not just college football. Don't get me started on the NFL, right? We never trace the problems of an NFL team, the lack of execution, the lack of the ability of the players, to the coaches. Very rarely. I mean, a direct connection. And a great example of that is right now, I think, the Cleveland Browns. You look at the Browns situation, Freddie Kitchens had never been an offensive coordinator, and he got hired as the head coach, right? Now, that's a management problem, too. Cliff Kingsbury, great example. Matt LaFleur, great example. Guys that should not be in those positions right now. And you've got a guy like Aaron Rodgers who can paper over that issue. At least he is right now. It looks like things may work out at Green Bay. But so it starts with management in the NFL. But there's no way Freddie Kitchens should be the head coach. And all of the coverage, and justifiably so, when you look at OBJ and you look at Baker Mayfield, two guys that are magnets for attention, right? And they initiate much of it, certainly. But the focus really there should be on coaching Freddie Kitchens, and it absolutely is not. it's well, he's a good guy, he's a nice guy, right? What? I mean, so we're sitting here banging on. I mean, Rex Ryan is calling Baker Mayfield the most overrated quarterback in the NFL after Mayfield played well last year. And we've got a guy there who is barely an offensive coordinator, not even as the head coach, and is totally overmatched in dealing with the media. You're kidding me. But that's of where we are in sports, in how we look at things, is we always defer. Now, the one sport where that is accepted by accepted is the NBA. That's the exception, right? In the NBA, it's all about the players. It's not about the coaches. Now, the Celtics were at that one time that I mentioned before with Brad Stevens. That's when it was all about the coach, and he proved himself. And why not? Look what he did at Butler. Phenomenal, right? That's coaching. That's not talent. What happened, though, when he finally got talent? Kyrie comes in, and it all falls apart. Now, maybe you see that's a better example, I think, when you put Brad Stevens in the context of Butler. So we're going to be visiting with Ben Strauss here, the Washington Post, and probably, I don't know if we'll get back to the, got a lot of stuff I wanted you to see, some clips in particular. Maybe we'll run those tomorrow if we don't have the opportunity. Thanks for taking the time, man.
Yeah, happy to be here. How's it going, Brooks?
Ben, can you? I'm doing great, man. Thanks so much. You getting some sleep?
Getting some sleep. A few hours here, a few hours there. I have
snatches here and there.
I have a 5-week-old, so it's touch and go.
So let's talk about ESPN and your coverage of ESPN and its coverage or lack thereof of the NBA situation in China. What did you find out in your reporting?
Well, I just thought it was an interesting sort of situation for the network. You've got the last 18 months with the new president, Jimmy Pitero, sort of saying we don't want to be political, but we also want to be the place of record. We want to cover, really cover the intersection of sports and politics without covering pure politics. And so when you get a story like this, right, this China story, this is a huge story, right, geopolitically, but it's a huge story for the NBA too. This is, when you think about the future of the NBA, when you think about, the values of the league, and even something as simple as the salary cap next year. You've seen reporting sort of looking and wondering what that's going to look like. So it's a really important story, number one, but also sort of one that tests the lines of what's political, what's not, and how you be the place of record, the worldwide leader in sports, without being too political. So I think it's sort of a really fascinating case study in what the policy is, and sort of how you want to cover stories, and what the effect, or sort of the real world consequences of the policy was. And so I think like a couple of things stood out. I think there were sort of I guess the main question that I had was, we can hear from people that how deeply do you want to get into issues of Chinese politics and Hong Kong? And you could say that you can't cover the story without addressing that in some way. You can also say that that's not ESPN's responsibility on any level. And so I could hear both sides of that. I guess the one place that I thought ESPN might throw some more resources was the nuts and bolts NBA side of it, and sort of we saw Yahoo report on questions about the salary cap. We saw Shams Charania at The Athletic had the first big story about that meeting between Adam Silver and the players, and then ESPN, which really prides itself on this bevy and stable of really, really good NBA reporters, didn't lead on the story, even on the NBA piece of the story. And I thought that was a little surprising.
Well, why do you think there was that reticence? Because if you look in the past, it would be somewhat understandable, I guess, if it was college football or the NFL. But the NBA has at times been aggressive in its treatment of issues as it pertains to politics and the intersection thereof. But why? What was that reticence, do you think? What was the basis of it? Or was there a reticence? It sounds like there was.
What was the reticence? I think there's like multiple layers to it. There's always, ESPN. I think ESPN gets this kind of scrutiny, number one, I guess I would say, because they do have a staff of journalists that's good enough to win a national magazine award. And it has shown, a really, impressive ability to do great journalism, which, that's why, sort of why don't you look at Fox Sports and sort of what have they done? And I think it's apples to oranges, and ESPN gets this scrutiny because, of the work they have done, and the idea or wanting to be the worldwide leader and place of record. There's always the question, and this goes back, years and years. There's nothing new here. How does you cover a league that you're in business with? This was always the question. And a lot of the times it came up with the NFL, and ESPN, for years has done, really good investigative reporting on, the owners and, head injuries and stuff like that. That's like a first question of layer. You're in business with the NBA, but China is sort of, with all these international corporations that want access to that market. ESPN has a deal with Tencent to distribute its content in China. And then Disney, its parents company, has, all sorts of business interests in China. And Bob Iger has been really excited about, doing Disneyland, Shanghai, and, the way you think about movie distribution and the way that a lot of movie studios have adjusted content to, maintain relationships with China. So you have like all sorts of layers, even beyond, the classic ESPN question of, you're this for-profit sports company, but you also want to do journalism on your business partners.
I think here's the big question, and we're talking to Ben Strauss of the Washington Post. Here's my big question. In the executive suite with Jimmy Pitaro, Burke Magnus, Norby Williamson, whether they're on a call or in an office, is what you just, the situation with the streaming partner Tencent, they're piping ESPN content into China, and then you have this massive business interest spurred by Disney and Bob Iger. Is that part of the equation editorially, you think, in this case with ESPN, Ben?
I don't know. I think it's kind of a risk reward situation. Is what is the risk of covering this versus what is the reward covering this? And you talk to, people who have been around ESPN, and right, like there is this reality that there are billions of dollars on the line, and sort of what is what's at risk if you do cover it, right? If you do have somebody go on TV and say something that puts this business relationship in jeopardy, is it worth it, right? And you can, look at the NBA, right? Like they would say what Daryl Morey did absolutely wasn't worth it, right? You have somebody who, sent this tweet and it's absolutely not worth it for what the league has gone through. And, ESPN can say the same thing. What is the risk of in the story we mentioned, prominent, really good NBA reporter Zach Lowe wanted to have somebody on from the Council of Foreign Relations. And what is the reward to that versus what is the risk?
Yeah.
But I don't think that there's like an edict or, a fiat, coming down from, the C-suite saying nobody touch this, because if you watched ESPN, there were a lot of conversations about this story. There were a lot of conversations that touched on the politics of the situation, from, the NBA wants to think, as most American or people in America want to think, that you're getting, by doing business with China, you're, helping to export democracy rather than import authoritarianism, which, is kind of the risk of what we've seen developed. And I think it was, on High Noon, I think it was Pablo Torre who said that. And that's a super political, explicitly political statement. So I guess sort of the no, or the sort of the pure politics policy, sort of sticking to that, and what is politics and what isn't, is sort of, I think, a bit confusing when you get a story like this.
When you're trying to figure out, I think, why Jimmy Pitaro was hired, and of course Pitaro had worked with Bob Iger, I think this might, and Jimmy Pitaro probably more than most media reporters or reporters in general, does this perhaps speak more than anything that the trust and the relationship that Pitaro had coming into this job, where Iger's not sitting there telling him not to do this, this, and this, but this really speaks to what defined Jimmy Pitaro in this role, to be able to steward that ship in this stormy situation?
Yeah, I think that I think they're doing what, right, sports news for sports fans. And I think, another thing you've heard is that, there are plenty of people who, when you think about what your audience wants, is, the ESPN audience, very, or perhaps does not want to tune into ESPN and hear about, the issues going on in Hong Kong. And so I think part of the, the Pitaro ethos is giving, this sports audience what the data says that they want. And it's sort of less about, if you want to understand the NBA, you've got to understand, sort of the NBA's role in China and what the league's trying to do and what's going on there, versus you kind of want to know, who won Thursday Night Football. And so I think there's a degree of, our audience wants this and we're going to give it to them. Not necessarily, our audience wants this, but they should know this other stuff too. And I think that's, sort of a ethos of the network in the Pitaro era. And I think their tagline on their website is, sports news to, serving the sports fan. I think that's sort of the fundamental, Pitaro era ethos.
And we're visiting with Ben Strauss. Last thing for you here, Ben, from the Washington Post. I do think that there is a gray area, and your report particularly spoke, reporting that Zach Lowe wanted to have someone on from the Council of Foreign Relations to try. And Zach Lowe, I think, was exactly correct to want to do that, because there's certainly a disconnect when it comes, I think, to Americans who aren't well versed on our relationship with China and the current regime, particularly, which is a little different regime than what we've had in the past before 2012. When you try to process the reaction of the Chinese government, right, and bringing the banners down and canceling all this stuff for what comes off somewhat of, it can't help but come off innocuous tweet. I think that there's a disconnect there in what the consequences were. And I think that's the one area where your ESPN, you can say, this is why this crazy stuff seemingly is happening. We've got a new regime or whatever it is. I think Zach Lowe was exactly right to try to bring that context in. And in my view, that would have served the sports fan, right?
Yeah, sort of why did this happen? And
right.
What does the NBA need to do to smooth it over, or sort of what is the NBA's next step in that market, or in China, basically to get the gravy trade rolling, and sort of how do you negotiate with the Chinese government? Like, that's a really interesting question, and it's a very NBA centric question, but you sort of need somebody who understands China to explain that to you, because then you get all these ripple effects of, what happens if the NBA, doesn't negotiate with China. Sort of what happens to the league, to the finances, again, to the salary cap, to the valuations of the franchise. Like the trickle down effect is this affects, wins and losses on the court. Actually, right? If it trickles down that far, and especially the other thing that it affects, if you've got NBA stadiums, there are how they handle, the Hong Kong protesters in the United States. We saw a couple of instances protesters who were asked to leave the stadium. That's a really big issue for the NBA to have to, figure out if it, and sort of when you think about that question of, exporting democracy versus importing authoritarianism. I mean, that's a really big deal.
Great reporting as usual, man. I can't thank you enough for taking the time. Thanks so much, Ben.
My pleasure, Brooks. Have a good one.
You too. That's Ben Strauss of the Washington Post at the vanguard of the coverage of the NBA China story. And if you watch this show, you're not missing, well, you're always going to miss something, right? But you probably know more about the situation than anybody you know in terms of why things are happening. And I think appropriately, Ben brought up the fact that it affects the salary cap because there's an enormous amount of revenue coming in. When you look at the amount of money, all right, here's a really important point. When you look at the amount of money NBA players make, Bradley Beal just signed a deal with the Wizards, okay? Bradley Beal, the Wizards. His deal is worth more guaranteed money than any contract in the history of the NFL. And I don't think he's even in the top 30 paid players in the NBA. Why? China. All right. So, and he referenced that. We're talking about wins and losses. We're talking about if you can keep a player or pay a player, or why do these guys make so much more money than other athletes? That's why. It's a big part of it. And I think it also informs the conduct of a Silver or LeBron James, right? Recognize that. And I think most importantly, it arms you to make your own decisions about what you're going to watch, what you think about this situation, what you think about us being in China at all, whether it's Apple, Google, or the NBA. So great stuff. Great guests today. Unbelievable. Ben Strauss, Washington Post, SEC Networks, Peter Burns, and John Walters of The Athletic. We're here every day, Monday through Friday. I want to thank our producer, Cam Smith, up in Boston, dealing with the weather today. I can't thank him enough. Thank you, Cam, for doing a great job under duress with the weather. And that's going to do it for today from Los Angeles. I'm Brooks Melchior saying so long. This has been Sports by Brooks on Fancred.